Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about Bishop Kent is a true man of God. He has more money than is needed. He likes to use it helping others, and this gets him in trouble with a gunfighter. Bishop Kent must face this man or run because his time is up. The Cunning of the Serpent. The mail came into Carnation twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays. It was brought over from Red Hills, the nearest railroad station 12 miles across the desert, by Joe Soers, a superannuated cowman. Soers made the trip to Jim Peterson, the postmaster, keeper of Carnation's chief emporium of general trade. Therefore, even when he was at home in his rare intervals of rest from the constant visitations throughout his enormous district, the Bishop of the Niobraras had 2 heavy days of inside work, since his mail receipts were larger than those of any other citizen of Carnation. The bishop's mail had another distinction. It contained the only regular paycheck that came into the little frontier town which was the geographical center of his work. This was because, being a missionary bishop, he received his salary from the missionary headquarters in New York once a month. As Jim Peterson was also the banker, the bishop had fallen into the habit of taking his check to the storekeeper as soon as he got it, and having it cashed. This unusual method of receiving one's income had excited much local comment, and it was well known that Bishop Kent always carried his check to Peterson's and came out with a roll of $250 once every month. This sum was far more than the bishop needed for his simple requirements, but it made it possible for him to perform a good many kindly acts with his right hand of which his left hand knew nothing. The recipients could be counted on, to say nothing. But the case of Rosie of the Gopher Hole's bevy of blossoms, had leaked out some time after Rosie's unexpected departure for the East. It had leaked out through the ugly mouth of Clark Shadwell. In a moment of very bad judgment, complicated by a certain amount of the Gopher Hole's very bad red liquor, poor Rosie had succumbed to the allurements Shadwell had been holding out to her, and had abandoned the frying pan of the Gopher Hole's precarious housing for the fire of Clark Shadwell's tumble-down shack on the edge of town. Rosie had never ceased to regret this step. But regrets did her no good. Like everybody else in Ornea Carnation, she soon came to know Shadwell for what he was, a truculent, transplanted hillbilly from the Tennessee mountains, a gunfighter, who, weaned on corn liquor and fed on rat-tail tobacco since before he had teeth, had found the scope of his native land too narrow for his expansive nature. He had come out into the Badlands where he would have room to swing a gat, and had picked on Carnation as his habitat. He had made it clear to Rosie that if she ever left him to go back to the Gopher Hole he would get her. This threat had held her through every variety of ill-treatment the business citizen of Carnation could think up. One Monday night the bishop had arrived home from a long visitation, and after his usual process of cleaning up, after 3 weeks away from his famous bathtub in the alkali dust, had stepped over to Peterson's for his accumulated mail. There was such a huge stack of it that he had not waited even to cash his check, but, intending to do so the next morning, had carried it all home with him. He was in the midst of this large batch of mail the next morning when a tap on the door interrupted him. He opened the door and Rosie stumbled in. She was weak and sick and half-starved, and she was suffering acutely from the effects of the beating Shadwell had administered the night before. Nobody except the bishop and Rosie, and the personage above, who was the bishop's boss, knew what the two said to each other, but about an hour later they came out of the bishop's little house and walked together along Carnation's main street of shacks to Peterson's store. Old Joe Soers was outside beside his dilapidated buckboard with its pair of rangy cow ponies, and the bishop paused to speak to him. "Kindly defer your leaving for a few minutes, Mr. Soers. There will be a passenger going with you to Red Hills." Old Joe nodded his dusty old head and spat reflectively in the thick dust of the roadway, saying nothing. The bishop accompanied Rosie into the store, cashed his check and, while the store loafers stood agape, counted out into Rosie's hand 10 $10 bills. The loafers followed the oddly assorted pair out in front of the store, and saw the bishop deferentially hand Rosie into the buckboard. "Take this young lady to the station at Red Hills, if you please," came the bishop's precise voice speaking to old Joe. Perhaps, too, you will be kind enough to see that she gets her ticket through to New York, and is placed safely on the train." "Aha," responded old Joe, shifting his quid nervously from one side of his leathern jaws to the other. The girl looked unutterable things at the little bishop who, removing his hat, bowed to her stiffly, and the buckboard started off at a great rate. Gravely saluting the men about the store doorway, the bishop turned on his heel, and with a measured tread which he never varied, about 21 inches to the step, Reddy Larimore had once reported, walked gravely back to his little adobe house by the creek side. Ed Hammond, proprietor of the Red Horse restaurant and bar, having learned what was in the wind, overtook the little man before he had reached his house. Hammond laid a huge, protective hand on the neat shoulder of the bishop's neatly pressed black coat. "Land's sake, Bishop, ya ain't mixin' in on this year Clark Shadwell's deals, are ye? Goss hamighty, man, that catty mount ain't got no respect for nothin' nor nobody. They tells me you're a helpin' this year gal of his'n to get away east. Why, man, he'll jest plumb ruin ye with lead bullets fer that, soon's he knows what ye've been up to. It's a wonder he hain't a rearin' round right now. Why, likely as not he'll be ridin' after a man kill a gal and old Joe to boot. Hain't he got no sense?" The bishop turned on Hammond a cool, level eye. "It's very good of you, Mr. Hammond, to warn me like this. I appreciate it highly, sir. But there is no immediate likelihood of his doing anything. I am informed by this unfortunate young woman that he is at the present time drunk, sir, dead drunk in fact. She will be aboard the noon train long before he awakens. I have no doubts about her safety. You may be interested to know that I have given her letters to people in New York who will see to her welfare." "Yeah, but..." Hammond choked at the little man's simplicity. "Look here, Bishop, I wasn't thinking so much about her, only kinda incidental like. Hit's muzzly you I'm a thinkin' about. You've gotta live right here, ain't ye? Well, then, all's I gotta say is, gosh sake, heal yourself. Can you do anything tall with a gun? I suppose not. Good land amighty. Have ye stopped to think what that roaring son of a gun'll do to you?" The bishop looked pleasantly up at his big friend who loaned him his dance hall and bar to conduct services in whenever he spent a Sunday in Carnation. He smiled like a child. "The Cunning of the Serpent. As I said before, it is extremely kind of you to take this interest, Mr. Hammond. I may tell you that I am not unmindful of my own personal safety. Perhaps you did not know that before I entered the ministry I studied law." Hammond interrupted. He spoke as a person speaks to a lovable but very inexperienced child. "Lord love ye, Bishop. This here ain't no question of law. Don't you see? You're dealin' in with a sharp and a bad egg. What's this here Shadwell care about law, good land?" Ed Hammond threw up his hands in a hopeless gesture. The bishop was incapable of understanding the situation. The bishop merely continued to smile like a child. "You misapprehend me, I am afraid, Mr. Hammond. What I meant to convey was only this, that in my study of the law I was frequently confronted with the maxim, never cross a bridge until you come to it. You see, while I am very grateful to you for your thought of me, yet, after all, we are anticipating, are we not? I fear you are crossing a bridge before arriving at it, Mr. Hammond. Just now Shadwell is in no condition to do anything. He may even remain unaware of what has become of this unfortunate young woman. He is not very popular, is he? There is no occasion for anybody to tell him of my small part in the matter, is there?" Hammond took his departure abruptly at this point in the conversation. He could not trust himself to speak again without profanity, so strong were his feelings at this moment. He did not wish to use profanity in the bishop's presence. The bishop continued placidly, 21 inches to the step, toward his little house, his mind on his unfinished letters. Hammond proceeded straight back to Peterson's store, gathered the loafers together, and discharged his mind. "And if any of yo shoats," he ended, "opens yo traps about it, the old man's cooked, I may tellin' ye, and if that happens, by the goss hamighty, there'll be 2 more folks full of lead in this year metropolis, the same bin that their skunk Shadwell and the saphead that spills a word to him." Peterson promised to see to it that old Joe kept his mouth tight shut. Clark Shadwell's first inquiry took place late that night. He was cold sober when he walked into the gopher hole, and he said little. Reluctantly convinced that nobody there knew anything about the subject of his inquiry, he was nonplussed. Shadwell's imagination did not reach the possibility of anyone's shipping his lighter love out of town. If she hadn't gone back to her old life at the Gopher Hole, she must necessarily be in some other man's house, or dead. As the days succeeded one another, and no evidence of Rosie's being above ground in Carnation, the conviction grew upon him that she must have met accidental death in some form, or, possibly, well, she had more than once hinted at doing away with herself. The bishop was away from Carnation for several weeks at one stretch, during the rest of the month, and when he returned Shadwell had made up his mind that if he had lost Rosie, at least no other man was hiding her out. On a certain Tuesday afternoon, the bishop and several other persons were in Peterson's store waiting for the contents of old Joe's mailbags to be sorted and distributed. The bishop received his letters and opened the first 2 or 3 that came to hand while talking to some of his acquaintances. He glanced through the contents and dropped the envelopes into the waste box which stood near the central stove. As soon as he was gone, Clerk Shadwell, who was present, poked at the trash in the waste box. Then, stooping, he picked out a stamped envelope which had caught his eye. It was the kind of envelope already stamped and with 3 dotted lines in the upper left-hand corner, along with the words, "If not delivered in days, return to." In these blank spaces were written a New York address, and the name, Rose Hollister. Shadwell spelled this out carefully, then, quickly crumpling the envelope, he dropped it back in the waste box and, without a word to anybody, walked out of the store and, unhitching his cayuse, loped off in the direction of his shack at the town's edge. As soon as he was gone, Ed Hammond picked out the crumpled ball and, straightening it out, read what Shadwell had read. Then, with a suppressed oath, he started for the bishop's house. The bishop, urbane as always, listened to his fervid second warning. Clerk Shadwell knew. By Rose Hollister's foolishness, and the bishop's innocence, there was no further concealment possible, and, as Ed graphically imparted it, was about to bust loose. Was the bishop healed? Goshamite. Here. Take this. Packet constant, 2. Goshamite. Hammond left, too full of wrath and concern for the bishop's safety to trust himself for further utterance, and the bishop picked up gingerly, and examined curiously, the small, compact, double-barreled derringer he had left on the table. That evening Doc Ellis had a hurry call to the bishop's house, and the next day the Carnation Toxin and Range Bulletin carried a circumstantial account of how the chief ecclesiastic of the territory had slipped and fallen on the floor of his famous bathroom, the bathroom his predecessor had installed, with a patent ram which pumped water from the creek, and a straining apparatus which removed part of the alkali mud from the water, and broken his right arm. The paper referred to this injury as a compound fracture, this descriptive item being furnished by Carnation's leading scientist, Doc Ellis. The next day the bishop, with his right arm in elaborate splints and a sling concocted of many rolls of bandage, went uncomplainingly about his affairs, and to all inquiries responded with a cheerful statement that his injury was nothing. Just nothing at all, thank you. How he managed for the subsequent days to dress would have puzzled Carnation if Carnation had been critical of such matters. But Carnation wasn't critical and, as Ed Hammond pointed out scornfully to one curious customer of his at the Red Horse, that their old bishop don't have to tie no necktie like other Easterners, 'cause he wears one of them purple dickies. To Hammond's importunities to watch his step, the bishop always returned assurances of his complete immunity from danger, and cited the fact that Shadwell had made no hostile move whatever against him. All Shadwell knew from having read Rosie's envelope was that Rosie had got away to New York and had written to him. There was no necessary connection between those facts and his complicity in her escape. On Friday of that same week, the bishop received his mail as usual and carried it home with him. Later in the evening he returned to Peterson's store to cash his check. Shadwell and several others were at the store. Peterson handed the bishop his bills, and the bishop placed them with his free left hand in the left-hand pocket of his neatly pressed black trousers, and took his departure after greeting pleasantly everybody in the store. Shadwell left within a minute afterward, and as there was no one present who could guess that anything was in the wind except Peterson himself, his exit excited no comment whatever. Peterson, greatly worried, and unable to leave because he was alone in the store, sent a boy for Hammond. Hammond arrived in a minute or two, and Peterson whispered to him that Shadwell had trailed the bishop out. Hammond sprang out of the door and hurried down the street toward the bishop's house. Past the lighted section of the main street he hastened and broke into a run as soon as he had left this behind him. As he ran he slid his holster around on his belt, and loosened its flap. The bishop was out of sight, and there was no trace of Shadwell, but Ed had noticed his cayuse still tied to the rail in front of Peterson's when he rushed out, and knew that Shadwell must be afoot, and not far away. He found the bishop's house in darkness, as he slowed his pace on arriving before it, and looked, with a worried expression, at the unlighted windows. He came nearer, walking stealthily now, his hand on the butt of his .45. He started to walk around the house, and as he neared the first corner he heard Shadwell's voice suddenly and stopped, drawing his gun, just within the concealing shelter of the house's edge. It occurred to him that at his usual gait the bishop had just about time to reach his house, and had gone around to the door at the farther side which he commonly used. Shadwell had probably taken the other side of the road, and had managed to pass the bishop on the way, unobserved in the dark. He had been waiting for the bishop around the corner of the house, and had confronted him there. That was it. He, Hammond, had managed to arrive just in time. Hammond edged himself along against the rough wall of the little house, ready to intervene at an instant's notice. He heard clearly Shadwell's ugly snarl, low-pitched as it was, around the corner of the house. "I said shove up yo hands, yo. Shove 'em up, now, right sudden, way up, or I'll blow yo to dash." "But, my dear sir," it was the bishop's clear voice, "can't you see that it is out of the question? I cannot move my right hand because it is bandaged tight." "Then shove up yo good arm, pronto, now, yo miserable lil pup yo." Ed Hammond stepped softly around the corner. He had guessed, correctly, that the bishop would be facing him, Shadwell standing so as to present his back, facing the bishop. He saw Shadwell's back and slouching shoulders, and the little bishop beyond him, his free left hand and arm perpendicular, the huge white bandage which confined the other conspicuous in the dimness of early evening. Shadwell was edging up toward the bishop, his gun held upon him. What could he be up to, exactly? Then Hammond saw through it. He was intending, first, to secure the roll of pills. When he had once got that safely away from the bishop, he could easily overcome the slightly built, elderly and now disabled little man. He would not risk the sound of a gunshot. Hammond raised his .45. But he was very unexpectedly interrupted. There came from close at hand a roar which made him jump, and ruined his steady aim. Shadwell had shot down the little man after all. Ed plunged forward. A gun was too good for Shadwell. He wanted to get his big powerful hands on him and choke the miserable life out of his worthless carcass. He stopped, confused in the dim light. The figure which he had dimly perceived as it tottered and fell to the ground in a limp heap lay almost under his feet. It writhed and rolled about, and from it there came a steady stream of profanity. At a little distance there stood the bishop, busily engaged with his left hand in unwinding the huge bandage from his right hand and arm. "What the?" gasped Hammond. "Ah, it is you, is it not, Mr. Hammond?" said the bishop. "You quite startled me, I assure you." He threw the loosened bandage to the ground and, transferring from his right hand to his left the double-barreled derringer from which a thin wisp of acrid smoke yet rose, he handed the deadly little weapon back to its rightful owner. "Dr. Ellis was very obliging," remarked the bishop, rubbing his cramped right hand which had just discharged the derringer through the bandage. "He took great pains with this arrangement. You see, Mr. Hammond, I have been for years unused to firearms, and so I could take no chances. That is why I waited until Shadwell came so close that I could hardly miss. I shot him, accurately, I think, through the right shoulder, so as to disable his gun arm. I hope I have not injured him too severely." Around the corner of the house came a confused group of men, in the lead, Tom Hankins, a deputy sheriff, carrying a lantern in one hand, a glistening blue-barreled .45 in the other. "What's all this ranicaboo?" inquired Hankins in a voice of authority. By the light of the lantern the bystanders envisaged the scene. They looked at the bishop, the bandage on the ground, they sniffed the sharp smell of burnt cloth which rose from the crumpled bandages. Hankins, stooping over, hauled the still cursing Shadwell roughly to his feet. His right arm hung helpless. One of the men picked up his undischarged revolver and looked at it curiously. "You come along with me to the calaboose, Shadwell," said Hankins grimly. "We've had our eyes on you for some time and now I reckon we've got you to rights." Hankins led away his captive, the other men closing in around them as they wended their way back toward the calaboose. The bishop looked at Ed Hammond who stood, his jaw hanging, and again the bishop smiled like a happy child. "I cannot help wishing that I had not been obliged to resort to such an expedient, Mr. Hammond," he remarked, as he picked up the bandages and turned toward his house. "But you may remember that we are exhorted in the scriptures to combine the harmlessness of doves with the cunning of the serpent. Good evening, Mr. Hammond, and thank you very much." Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.